the 1968 time frame, and I want to say towards the beginning of the year versus the end, is when we actually saw the first recorded minutes of the Maricopa Live Steamers. And then it was from that point in 68 until the end of 72 when we formally incorporated. Does that sort of sound?
That's close anyway. I don't know the exact dates.
I've got to chase the minutes down for those. Because I think in the early minutes, oh gosh, it's been a while since I've looked at them. I want to say in the early minutes, which you would have been taking minutes on as the secretary, it was classified as the Phoenix Live Steamers. It was actually shown in the minutes as the Phoenix Live Steamers, and then eventually, like you said, it migrated over to Maricopa County.
The Maricopa Live Steamers.
And the Maricopa Live Steamers. And I think part of that was self-defense, if I remember right, because we didn't know where we were going to end up. So if we said Maricopa, that pretty well covered a half a dozen towns.
That's not as far as we wanted to go.
We hit on one of them.
Yeah. That was made pretty clear that we weren't going to get a location in Phoenix anywhere.
Yeah.
That's why we changed it.
The other piece of trivia that goes into our incorporation, which is still around today, is the very first big engine the club owned, which is 7282. That's where it got its number from. It was 1972 was our incorporation date, and 1982 is when we bought it.
It's just kind of hazy there. The guy Silma might have paid for that.
No, he didn't.
No, he didn't?
No,
Okay.
that was actually another piece of trivia. Right now, the club has a $100 usage fee one time to run any of the club engines. And the question is, okay, where'd the $100 come from? And the $100 came because we sold bonds, or people threw in money or something like that, and they were throwing in $100 a pop, because the engine, I think, cost $8,000, $7,000, something like that. And people could throw in incrementals of $100 to buy this locomotive. And the other part of the history, was it Chet Peterson? Is he the one that built that? Not Railroad Supply, or was it?
I don't know. No, I don't mean Railroad Supply.
It would be Chet Peterson, Railroad Supply. He brought it over and said, what about it, guys? And we love the engine, big engine, all that kind of good stuff. We didn't have any money in the treasury for it. So that's when they passed the hat and people were throwing in essentially $100 bills to buy a piece of the action. And I want to say, I know we sold bonds. I remember selling bonds because I was the treasurer having to cash all of those suckers out when it came due. And we did one of three things. They could either get their money back direct plus the interest. They could get the money donated into the treasury just as an outright donation, or they could apply it to dues. And that's how we liquidated all the bonds. And I will bet you that if you go back into some of the early paperwork, you'll still see some of the original bonds that were never sold or issued. We still got them in the back of a book somewhere. Because I remember cashing them out.
I never donated to that because I don't run diesel.
That's true. That's true.
Should we take a 5-minute break?
Take a 5-minute
All
break.
right.
Oriented park. And she says, if that ever goes away, she says, I will reclaim owning this property, and she says, I will sell it as industrial property. And that's the last thing in the world. It's costing a lot of industry at that point.
Yeah.
But by the same token, they had never in their wildest dreams expected to make the money off that park in mid-June.
The thing that was interesting, I don't recall the details because I was never I'm not a resident of Scottsdale, so everything I got was more or less second or third hand. But it was the idea that the Scottsdale City Council, I got a very strong feeling, had a major issue with some millionaire telling them what they could or could not do. It didn't set well when they were told, this is a railroad theme park and da-da-da-da-da, and if you take it away, I'm going to take the property back and so on. And there was significant hostility, is maybe a good word, for the railroad park, because none of the other parks in the valley within a 100-mile radius were railroad theme parks. This was an odd duck. And totally. And what happened, to the council's embarrassment, one council member in particular, who was the most vocal against it, was that all of a sudden the sucker got popular. On weekends, Saturday and Sunday, that park started getting packed. And
That's when they decided that we needed to move.
Well, that was part of it. But you mean from the old location to the new one? Yeah, from our old parking lot location, which was, like I said, about 50 steps north of the passenger car that's there now. They pulled us out completely. We had a clubhouse there. And the clubhouse had 3 storage tracks inside it that, if I remember right, Bill Unglaby made. And he made them out of like particle board. So there were wooden switch tracks, so you could push a car in, throw this wooden switch, run it in, and we could actually store trains without having to physically pick them up. You just ran them back and forth on this ladder track to get them stored.
So, it was better than anything that we had.
Yeah, we had nothing at the time. So this was our original location. And as Roger was commenting, guy came up to him and said,
he asked me if we would move. I said, well, guys, the guys have got a lot of work into where we are. I said, what's going on? He said, well, he said, the city has gotten, the park has gotten so busy, there's no place to park. And the city wants to make a parking lot where you are. So he says, if you will agree to move, he said, we will do all the grading and everything else needs to be done. All you have to do is lay the track. So we talked it over and we agreed to do it. And so that's kind of how that got laid out. And as I said earlier, we were trying to figure out how, what kind of a track layout we wanted. So we had, well, we'll just try to have a contest here to see, and we'll all draw different track plans and we'll look them over, and the ones we like the best, we'll choose. And Bill Unglaby is the one that drew the track plan that we have now, and that they have over there, which is a very nice track. Got maximum run per minimum running space, and it was a nice track to run on. So the city did all the grading for us and everything. We laid the track. We had to fill in some stuff and everything, but with ties and all that kind of stuff. But it worked out well. So that's how we ended up over there.
Because where we originally were was an ideal location for a live steam railroad. Namely, it was flat ground. Unfortunately, it was also therefore very good ground for a parking lot because it was flat. So that's when we moved over from point A to point B in the cycle.
And one area in back where it goes up, they built that all up for us.
Yep.
And
So Bill Unglaby was the one who got the culverts and made the tunnel.
For the tunnel, was that Bill? Okay. And we salvaged as much as we could from the old stuff. I mean, there was only so much you could do. By that point in time, the 3/4 inch was pretty well non-existent. I think Matt Fairley might have been the only one with 3/4 inches at that time. And I don't know if he had since died or whatever. So when we moved to the new location, it was strictly dual gauge, meaning 7.5 inch gauge dominantly, with, I think the 4 3/4 was dual gauge.
Yeah, 4 3/4 was dual gauge, and on the inside loop. The outside loop was
Oh.
7.5.
That's right, we had two dual gauges. We had 3.5 and 4 3/4 dual gauge innermost. Then we had 4 3/4, 7.5 inch gauge, dual gauge around that. And then the rest of it was 7.5 around everything else.
Right. Well, the inside track was, like you said, dual gauge, 1.5 and 4 3/4, or 7.5 and 4 3/4. And probably that's where the 3/4 inch, this 3.5 inch gauge was also.
Actually, if I remember right, this is going to be a good check for somebody else to go to. We were debating how the city said you can go down the east side of the park if you want. Well, there was a drainage swale between where we were and where the south side of the park was, so one of the big debate issues at the time was, how do you get across this drainage swale, this wash? And one thought was, just lay track down the wash, and when it rains you don't go south. And the other one was, well, we could put in some sort of a bridging culvert, whatever system to go over it. And I don't remember, I think we fiddled around too long.
Well,
And
the city council back down on that. We had petitioned with them to extend our track around the south edge of the park and up along the west edge, and then turn around there and come back. And the city was considering that, and they said, no, you can't do that. And that was one of the things that led us to deciding to look for some other place, because we couldn't expand. And our membership is growing all the time, and we were having meets out there, and it was getting awfully crowded.
The interesting thing, I've heard another story, which maybe you might have picked up on from Guy. So, Guy's envisioning, from what I understand, is that we would not only be allowed to go down the east side of the property, across the south end, but then up the short west wall that was adjacent to the apartments, do a hook turn and go west all the way out to Scottsdale Road, and then take a right turn going north up, and then he had us planned for probably about 3 miles of track.
That was our plan, yeah.
Well,
Yeah, oh yeah.
because Guy had all sorts of plans, but the steamers never quite got as far as his planning went. And part of the problem we ran into also, if I remember right, Raj, was the city would say, we would ask them, well, can we go around in back of the building,
shops, yeah.
the shop, and just do a simple turnaround, come back out? And the city would say, yeah, and we'd start getting all sorts of plans made, and then they would come back and say, well, we got to send it to a planning committee. So everything went into, and it was one of these, yes you can, no you can't, yes you can, no you can't, so finally we quit
We
doing
did.
it. But, yeah, we had some interesting times back there. We initially started out in the final configuration at Scottsdale with a folded 8. And the objective was to then put in passing sidings and run two-way operations using signaling. But before all of that could happen, one of our members, they kept laying longer and longer passing sidings, and one of the members, or group of the members, whatever, they finally decided instead of a 2-track folded 8, we'd go to a 3-track folded 8, which meant all you could do is go one direction because there was no way to put in passing sidings.
I thought that was pretty much Bill's original idea, one over the top and one over the bottom.
That was the folded 8.
Mm-hmm.
But then, if you think about it, if you remember right, they had the 2 tracks that went around the curve as you left the station. And I thought they went into a gauntlet track. Didn't they run into one of those throat tracks?
In the tunnel, yes.
Yeah, and when they did the tunnel, it was in one of those gauntlet tracks where the 2 tracks overlap each other but never touch. they have frogs at each end so the tracks can then split back out.
Kind of like the switch when you couldn't switch.
Yeah. Now, I dug out some more stuff. See how much of this you can relate to. This is now up to the 1974 January era. And he listed from 74 on was the officers of the club. By this time, we had incorporated back in 72. And as per the Corporation Commission, you have to have a board of directors. Up until then, we didn't have a board because we didn't need one. You had a president, a vice president, a secretary, treasurer, and everybody was happy. But when we incorporated, the commission said you had to have the board and all that stuff, which is where the board of directors came from. It was as per the commission. But back in January of 74, the president was Don Bauer. Art Johnson was the vice president. And here's that other name again, that Netz guy, who was the secretary treasurer back in then, with Dick Morris and Jim Kuntz on the, as a board of director member. And if I remember right, Jim Kuntz, second generation, Don Bauer, second generation, were they the safety committee?
I think so.
That's sticking in my mind that they were the safety committee. The one thing we were talking about when we had a break, the track that came up from, was it Gila Bend or Casa Grande?
Here, Ben.
Gila Bend. The track that came up, I think there was no place to store, there was no place to run the track and put it down because we didn't have any property there.
Right.
So, if I remember correctly, it was all temporarily stored at Fritz Kuster's place, and
Now, he said you put it in my yard.
we just stored it in his yard. And if I remember the story correctly, at some point in time, while we were still looking for a home, Fritz basically went to the club and said, "Can I lay a loop around the house?" Because he had a little Engines American, a 440. And so he took probably, 250, 300 foot of track and made a loop around it. And then I think probably the rest of the track eventually was what went up to Bernard's place. So,
Don Bernard had his own, he bought his own rail and everything.
did he?
He did use club track.
So-
And they go out to Bob and Netz's house.
Okay. That would have been it. For those people who had never seen, there was a comment, I think, in one of the Stack Talks. We happened to be over at Bob Manette's house for one of our meetings, because we didn't have any other place to go at that time. And Bob was building an 1.5-inch early American, a 440. And I don't know if I don't think he got too many castings. I think he was a machinist by trade. So when he needed hex head rivets, he made them. He machined out hex head rivets. And he took his 1.5-inch engine to a model show, and he won a ribbon with it.
And the thing was
'Cause he had-
beautiful.
Huh?
The thing was beautiful.
Oh, gosh.
And like a watch.
Absolutely beautiful engine. But it was just, as a machine, he does things that a machinist would do that the rest of her going, "Don't you have anything better to do with your time?" But that was his thing, and he did an excellent job. It was also Bob, and I'm jumping ahead quite a bit, we wanted us poor non-machinist types to at least get some rudimentary skills on the machine shop. So we finagled, and I don't remember the year, it's probably in one of these back issues, we finagled a class at Mesa Community College on machine shop. And it was basically, the word went out to only the live steamer types. Our club was the only one that really, quote, knew about it officially. I think we ended up with one student in the class who had nothing to do with the club. He saw it in the listings and wanted to take it. but Bob Manette was the instructor for the class. And that's where a good chunk of the early members got work with lathe, mill, grinding stuff, anything like that came out of that particular one semester class. It was interesting.
Talking about Bob Manette, I worked with Bob at Motorola. I was a machinist also. And so I had a friend in Dayton, Ohio, who's a live steamer. Built some beautiful stuff. And his name is Joe Whitaker. And his son was building a home-built airplane. So Joe sent me a picture he had taken of his son's airplane. And sitting in the background was the chassis for his Shaft-Tail 282, both Warren, Ohio Mike. And he built that engine, bolt for bolt, to the original Beetle blueprints. And the guys would tell him, Joe, you don't have to do that for a live steamer. Joe said, I know that, but I'm going to do it once. And he did. That engine was a Swiss watch. But anyway, Joe sent me a picture of it. And so because of the airplane, I took it to work to show it to Bob. And I thought you'd like to see this. I said, a friend of mine's son is building it. He says, the hell with the airplane, what's that in the background? And so I explained it to him. He said, man, he said, I want to know more about that. So that's how he got involved with live steaming.
From a photograph.
Mm-hmm.
There is another anecdote that goes into this hobby that it shows up in an early edition of the Stack Talk. The name shows up. But unless you were kind of involved back then, you can't totally associate what happened. The kid, young man, 20 plus or minus, his name was Mike Prickly, if I remember correctly. He made a steam bicycle. Now, we think of steam tractors, we think of steam launches, steam engines, stationary steam, all of that. Mike built a steam-powered bicycle. And it was in Live Steam magazine.
And we knew Mike quite well.
And I don't remember. He since evolved and went other places, and I don't know where all he went, but it was just, we've had some interesting things in there. As a matter of fact, let's digress since we're back over in the early days at Scottsdale. We met over at Don Bauer's house, and Don Bauer actually lived in Sun City. He was barely old enough to qualify.
Why he lived with
He
his
was
parents.
with his parents. Yeah, he was living with his parents over in Sun City. Any rate, this was at the time when we were getting interactive with Scottsdale. And I think it was either Dick or Don to run, I think it was either once or maybe twice a month. And the city also wanted to know if we wanted them to dig a hole big enough to where we could run steam launches. Well, nobody in the club was into marine steam at that point in time, and we were trying to think of how big of a lake are you going to make for a steam launch that anybody could get in, type thing. So we politely said to the city, thanks but no thanks on the lake. But just to show you what the club was like back then, the word we sent back to the city is that we would not run 1 or 2 times a month for them. We would run every Sunday for them at no charge.
What year was this?
Right? When did we start? I don't even remember when we started hauling the public. I'd have to go
Right
back.
from the, anybody wanted to ride, we'd take them.
Yeah, you really had to have, we didn't have a station like they had until later on, but this was early on. But the city was very cooperative in terms of allowing us to call some shots on what we wanted, especially in the early stages when they were moving dirt and whatnot. But and that's how we got into every Sunday afternoon runs, is because we said we would do it. And it would be, the city said, you can charge for your rides, and we said, no, we'll just take donations. And the donations were 10 to 15,000 a year. So it
And
worked
then
out.
Matt Fairley came along with, I can't remember who else it was, and decided we needed to charge for our rides. And I fought that tooth and nail, but they went ahead and passed it. That's how they got started having paper right out there. But the city got their share of it too.
And then going back to the laundry list, in '75, Dick Wiebolt, who came in a month after I did, was president. Russ Jocelyn, who came in the month I did, was vice president, and I was secretary treasurer at the time with Don Bauer, Glenn Butler, and Russ Kean on the board. And then in '75, Dick Morris was president, Jim Marks was vice president, and Judy Van Steenkist was the secretary treasurer with Glenn Butler, her husband Keith, and Russ Kean on the board. Then Dick Morris was in '77, and Matt Fairley was the president in '77 October, with Russ Kean and Judy Van Steenkist, with Dick Morris on the board, with Keith, Mel Gooch, and Carl Wicks was on the board.
I forgot about Carl, yeah.
Pardon?
I forgot about Carl.
Carl Wicks formed a company called ATCO, and I want to say it was Arizona Traction Company.
I think so.
I think it was, he was traction, as in streetcar, as opposed to anything else, but he made cars. Now, Carl evolved a philosophy in car making. He actually, I want to say, made kits, put together kits. And Carl's philosophy was, these kits are not being made for scale, they're being made for people's butts. And so instead of making them 7.5-inch gauge double to 14 or 15-inch gauge cars, he widened them to 16-inch gauge cars.
Which went over like a lead balloon.
Well, the kits didn't. Actually, I still have one of his original gondolas in my backyard.
Well, he would make them both in regular scale width and everything, and he would make the extra wide ones.
But APCO, he would lived in, I want to say it was on Shea, off of Shea and Scottsdale general area over there. And that's where he had his business. And the last I heard, he had moved up into the Verde Valley. And I since learned that he's died some years ago. I don't remember how far.
He called me up one weekend, one day, and he was living in Preston then. And he said, Roger, can you come up and get some of this stuff? I said, okay, so I went up there, and he gave me a lot of his drawings and stuff like that. And I think he died shortly thereafter.
Could have been. Let me rattle off some, while we're on a recording session, let me just rattle off some of the names of past presidents. I won't get into the other officers, but just so people have a flair for it, picking up after Matt Fairley, which was '77, '78, we had Bill Unglavi for a couple terms, then Dick Wiebolt for a couple terms, then Ed Jensen for a couple terms, Dave Harnish for a couple terms, Ron Bernard for 4 terms, Bob Deal, Robbie's dad, for 1 term, Bert Shapley for a couple terms, and that took us up through '93, and that's all I was able to pull for officer ranks up to that point in time. But we've had quite a few presidents, quite a few past presidents that are around, and a lot of them, unfortunately, people don't know the name, just because it's been in the early days of the club a long time ago. And we got some, it's the, by the way, the piece of trivia that hasn't been said yet, if you do the math, and eventually I'll find the old secretary minutes for the Phoenix Live Steamers in 1968, if you take 68 and add 50 to it, it comes out 18, meaning next year is the 50th anniversary of the Maricopa Live Steamers. And so one of the events we will need to try to do is resurrect a more accurate date so we can plan on a party. And we'll get a big cake and Roger can jump out of it and we'll,
Roger doesn't do much jumping anymore. He does
Well, it's
falling,
funny.
but he doesn't jump.
we'll just have the cake open
The
then.
cake will open up.
But,
So now we're into the 90s, early 90s with the board. So do you want to bring us up to? And then we found some property.
well, what was happening is with all the consternation that was going on with the city, yes you can, no you can't, yes you can, no you can't. Somewhere in that time, and this is what we don't have accurate recordings on, Al Ford and Bob Martin, and there may be others, and I don't remember who all, were looking around and they found ultimately what became the Adobe Dam Recreation Area. And by virtue of its location, you can't do anything with it. You can't build on it because it's in a floodplain. But it doesn't hurt railroad tracks. Well, it hurts the tracks when the flood comes, but the tracks aren't an inhibitor to water like a house would be. So at that point in time, we had our thing going in Scottsdale. By then we had 4 crews. I was the superintendent of operations at that time, and I was crew scheduler. So we had regular Sunday crews that would handle first, second, third, fourth Sunday, and then on fifth Sunday we would put together a kludge of whatever it took to run fifth Sunday. And we were giving public rides at that point in time. Well, if you assume an average income of anywhere from 10 to 15,000 a year, our treasury was going pretty nice. It gave us the ability to buy rail and track and stuff that we couldn't have done otherwise because we just simply didn't have the money. When I was treasurer, we had $30 in the treasury and we thought we were in good shape.
At least we were not in debt.
We weren't in debt. We still had something in the black. We couldn't go out to eat anything on it, but we had money.
Well, then you could, now you can't.
True. But the decision was made, independent of anything going on with Scottsdale, that we would allocate some of our funding, our resources, to start an expansion of the Maricopa Live Steamers, call it the Northwest or West or North or whatever you want, and it was to be an evolution over at Adobe. And that's where we got started with Adobe, and the seed money for Adobe came from the public runs at Scottsdale, because with the city's injunction, we couldn't go anywhere. I mean, we had laid all the track we could lay.
And there were more and more people joining your club, more and more engines running.
And the meat was coming in, and we're going, okay, now what? And so some of it started getting funneled over to Adobe, and that's a different story altogether. Basically, we had well-attended meets, as I remember.
Very much so. We even had an Allegheny there one time for a big 2666. And we had a lot of people coming from California and other places. And they liked to come down and run with us.
We didn't have a big track. Like I said, it started out originally as just a folded 8, 2/3 of a mile. But whiskers on the steaming bay. We had a steaming bay set up. I had made some phone calls, found a business over in Mesa that was willing to either sell or give us a used hoist from a garage, but it wouldn't hold its fluids well enough, so we couldn't use it. But for us to lower locomotives up and down between the back of a tailgate and onto an off-ramp, there was plenty of good. So we got a hoist in there, a hydraulic hoist to offload with. It would rotate and stuff, and then we would roll it off onto one of the whiskers of the steaming bay, and then it would go around. And then eventually we got, I don't remember the chronology at this point, we got the two-story engine building built. The old one was torn down, and they built a new two-story one.